Greetings, adventurers. You're listening to The Quiet Journeys of Professor Atwood with me, Professor Atwood. I'm glad you're here, and I can't wait to tell you about my latest journey. Don't worry, it's a safe space. I'll handle all the danger for you. I designed these stories to help you relax, chill anxiety, and go to sleep. Maybe they'll even put a smile on your face, even if it's a sleepy smile. So please, settle in, relax, and prepare to quietly drift off with me to parts known, unknown, and even some places in between. Comfortable? Very well. Let's get underway. Good evening, adventurers. I hope you're doing well. I also hope you're all cozy and settled in because tonight I'm going to tell you all about how I upgraded my submarine, the O2, and finalized my preparations to set off and confront Professor P, my nemesis. Now, as you remember from last time, Professor P had challenged me to some kind of science duel. He was fuzzy on the details. And if I won, he would tell me the location of my long-lost mentor, Professor Sampson, who vanished mysteriously years ago. I had finished my packing and was on my way to the submarine dry dock to meet Frank, who was performing the upgrades. But I had to make a stop at the Getty Museum to pick up an experimental engine part, which I would need for the said upgrades. There I spent some time with Professor Cook, who at one time was romantically involved with Professor Sampson a while back, and she was hopeful I could locate him. I told her I would do my best. I had tried to find him before without success, so I was also hopeful that this time would be different. While I was prepared, I would still have to figure out how to defeat Professor P in this vague science duel he had challenged me to via Messenger Raven. And then he would tell me the whereabouts of Professor Sampson, if he wasn't lying, of course. Evil scientists do that too, unfortunately. Now, as I said before, like years earlier, when I had first learned of my mentor's sudden and mysterious disappearance, I did try to find him. I literally scoured the globe. But I had no luck, and eventually I had to give up the search. But I never lost hope. Anyway, before I tell you about launching the O2 back into the water to find Professor P, I'd like to mention something about our stories, especially for the new listeners. You Professor Atwood OGs, that's what Bradley says, already know the score. Anyway, the stories are designed for you to drift in and out of, and while yes, I do like to tell you a full story every episode, drifting in and out or falling completely asleep is factored into the equation. You can pick things up anywhere, and that's why I do the story recaps at the beginning, and you can go back and listen to previous adventures anytime you wish. So, by all means, enjoy the show any way you wish. It's designed that way. No rules and no pressure, adventurers. And as always, don't forget to rate and review the show, and maybe post about the show, because that's how other adventurers find us. And if you want more info, merchandise, and donation and Patreon subscription options, you can always go to whitecatentertainment.com. Every bit helps, and as always, we thank you for your support. All right then, let's get back to the story. I met Frank in the submarine dry dock where he was upgrading the O2 submarine, and while I needed to get going as soon as possible, these speed and efficiency upgrades were crucial, so they would be well worth the delay. I rolled the cart from my car to the dry dock and delivered the WETS system from the Getty Propulsion Lab, which was basically a hybrid water desalination hydrogen conversion system. I was looking forward to having it installed, as it would not only increase our maximum knots, It would provide unlimited potable water for the submarine. Frank met me at the submarine dry dock, and he was covered in grease. I mean, he was usually covered in grease as a mechanic, but it seemed like he had more on him than usual. Frank greeted me warmly and did indeed confirm that one of the grease guns developed a rather bad leak, and that's why he had a bit more on him than usual. And he said he also didn't want to stop and change because there was a lot of work to be done. But I told him it's okay to change out of greasy clothes. Frank reluctantly agreed and went to change. After he came back, we wasted no time and started to go over all of the submarine upgrades, including the ones on the engine. There were a lot of upgrades, but Frank and his small crew had implemented a fair amount of them already. He had upgraded the ballast system, strengthened all 3 of the O2's hulls. Now, most submarines have 2 hulls. The O2 has 3. There were even galley upgrades along with an upgraded game room. I don't know how he found more room, but he managed to move some conduit panels and cables around more and was able to fit one more retro arcade cabinet. And I picked a tail gunner to be loaded in. That's one of my favorites next to Spy Hunter. Frank and his crew also upgraded the satellite/manual drone periscope to see above the surface, even when we were still deeply submerged, along with cleaning off the manual periscope as well. Now, the boat pod probably received the biggest upgrade. As you remember, when we were thrown off course a while back and accidentally found a hidden off-the-charts island, I wanted to investigate, but there was no way in. But the top of the rock face surrounding the island was shrouded in mist, and that had me curious. I converted the boat pod to rise like a hot air balloon to go over the top of the island's misty rock apex, and planned to enter the island, which was too misty for any imaging or sensors to penetrate, which I also found odd and suspicious. My theory proved correct, and I sailed up and over the rock face, into the mist, and down into the center of the island. Now, as you remember, that's how I discovered my friend Benny's hidden island vacation home. It was much easier to get there the second time for the wedding, since, well, we were invited, and the holographic aqua camouflage was turned off for the guests. Anyway, that was a jerry-rigged boat pod and not the best option for future adventures. But I needed something that could fly, albeit slowly, just in case. But we also had limited space in the submarine, obviously, and I still needed a boat pod. Frank ingeniously combined both needs into a new support vehicle, the Aeropod, which was a hybrid boat and balloon vehicle to give me extra flexibility on whatever we may find on this adventure. He also said he upgraded the propellers to give us a little more speed in balloon mode, but it was still a balloon, so he told me to manage my expectations. I smiled and said I appreciated the upgrade and all the effort, of course. But it was then time to do the main upgrade, the engine. Frank took the wet system off the cart and said he and his crew would work on it immediately so I could be on my way. But he stressed they would still need time for testing, and I said of course I understood. His pet cricket, Barney, chirped in a cage next to him. Frankly, I was surprised it was still alive, as they only live for about 8 to 10 weeks, but Barney seemed to be doing just fine, and Frank said he was surprised as well, although he did notice Barney was indeed slowing down a bit, but hoped he would be around a bit longer. He said he could always get a new cricket, but it wouldn't be the same. I said I understood, even though I was hoping Frank would move up to larger, longer-lasting pets. Anyway, as I mentioned before, the plan was to upgrade the O2 engine to a dual function like the Aeropod. The new upgraded engine would intake ocean water, desalinate it for use inside the submarine, then split the water molecules and harvest the hydrogen for power, and the only emission would be bubbles and water vapor. and since I'd be in the ocean, it was the perfect place to emit more water and a little oxygen. Now, admittedly, a water-fueled engine that splits the molecule and harvests the energy from the hydrogen has been theoretical for years. We all thought we were going to see cars that ran on water, these so-called water cars that were going to change the future. Well, no, as good as these intentions may have been, it didn't quite work out that way. Now, the truth is, it takes a lot of energy to split a water molecule, and at that point the energy gained may not be worth it. However, if you're using the engine as part of a hybrid system that also harnesses the motion of the seas and also serves as a water desalinator, courtesy of the wet system developed by the Getty, the whole enterprise becomes a lot more appealing. Now, for sure, if you're desalinating water and creating energy for your submarine as part of a hybrid engine system, it begins to make more sense. But for automobiles, I can't really say we're quite there yet. And with the focus on electric cars, I don't know if we ever will be. But submarines are another story, and I took full advantage of that fact in a nice collaboration with the Getty research scientists in the propulsion lab. But to give you a little interesting background, a water-fueled car is an automobile that hypothetically derives its energy directly from water. Water-fueled cars have been the subject of numerous international patents, newspaper and popular science magazine articles, local television news coverage, and of course, websites. The claims for these devices have been found to be pseudoscience, and some were found to be tied to investment frauds. Now, it is especially unfortunate when a promising scientific breakthrough is corrupted by bad actors. I had my suspicions that Professor P and the infinite science cabal were behind it, because water is cheaper than any other fuel we have right now, and that would have cut into their funding, especially for their pollution division. Anyway, these vehicles sometimes claim to produce fuel from water on board with no other energy input, or may claim to be a hybrid claiming to derive some of its energy from water in addition to a conventional source, such as gasoline. But we already have hybrids, so the hydrogen/combustion engine just doesn't really seem all that practical. Most proposed water-fueled cars rely on some form of electrolysis to separate water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then recombine them to release energy. However, the first and second law of thermodynamics guarantees that the energy required to separate the elements will always be at least as great as the useful energy released, so this cannot really be used to produce net energy. So a creative solution or workaround is needed, and believe me, there are no workarounds to the laws of thermodynamics. Even Tom the Futurist, who was from the future, admitted that the classics never change, and I got his meaning. Tom, of course, liked to be deliberately vague on things, as to not pollute the timeline with knowledge of the future. Like I said before, at least that was his excuse, but on a personal level, I really think he just loved being cryptic, as he would always try to hide a smile as he would say things like, "I can't tell you how that turns out. Butterfly effect, you know, that sort of thing." I don't think he ever believed it himself, but like I said, he enjoyed the game. Anyway, it's interesting as to what specifically water-fueled vehicles are, but it's also interesting as to what they are not. This is where the science and my application of it branches off a bit. I was implementing a hybrid aquakinetic hydrogen engine with water desalination on a submarine, which is very useful if you're on a submarine. There's no real mass market appeal for that if you don't own one, but it's interesting to note the similarities and differences. For instance, a water-fueled car is not water injection, which is a method for cooling the combustion chambers of engines by adding water to the incoming fuel-air mixture, allowing for greater compression ratios and reduced engine knocking or detonation. A water-fueled car is not a hydrogen car, though it often incorporates some of the same elements. To fuel a hydrogen car from water, electricity is used to generate hydrogen by electrolysis. The resulting hydrogen is an energy carrier that can power a car by reacting with oxygen from the air to create water, either through burning in a combustion engine or catalyzed to produce electricity in a fuel cell. But these aforementioned elements of a hydrogen car most closely resemble the engine for the O2, my submarine. That was my starting point. Now, a water-fueled car is not a hydrogen fuel enhancement where a mixture of hydrogen and conventional hydrocarbon fuel is burned in an internal combustion engine, usually in an attempt to improve fuel economy or to reduce emissions. Now, a water-fueled car is not a steam car, although it seems like it would be. The steam car uses water, in both liquid and gaseous forms, as a working fluid, not as a fuel. Now, according to the currently accepted laws of physics, which is an interesting disclaimer, there is no way to extract chemical energy from water alone. Water itself is highly stable. It is one of the classic molecules and contains very strong chemical bonds. Its enthalpy of formation is negative, meaning that energy is required to break those stable bonds to separate water into its elements. And there are no other compounds of hydrogen and oxygen with more negative enthalpies of formation, meaning that no energy can be released in this manner either. Most proposed water-fueled cars rely on some form of electrolysis to separate water into hydrogen and oxygen and then recombine them to release energy. However, the first law of thermodynamics guarantees that the energy required to separate these elements will always be equal to the amount of energy released, assuming no losses. So this cannot be used to produce net energy. The second law of thermodynamics further states that the amount of useful energy released this way is necessarily less than the amount of the energy input. Now, all of these laws of thermodynamics, of course, hold true. So the challenge and trick was to not overcome them so much, but to lean into them in new and creative ways. That's why any worthwhile hydrogen engine needs to be a kind of hybrid, where energy is also harvested in different ways to compensate for the energy loss during electrolysis and the recombination of water molecules. If you want to go in that direction, as opposed to using pure hydrogen for your fuel conversion. But that always led me to the question, why not both? Or even, why not combine multiple processes, including harvesting the kinetic energy of the ocean itself as you travel through it? You can combine them all in the same engine and create a net gain of energy, and get unlimited fresh desalinated drinking water while you're under the ocean to boot. And everything would lead into running green and being, ecologically, minimally invasive. And that's the approach Frank and I, with the help of the Getty propulsion scientists, took to overhaul my submarine, the O2. With multiple processes and multiple end goals going on at the same time, the net result was a positive energy and water gain. Admittedly, I did need a little extra energy for the submarine's galley and game room, but I was not about to give up my minimal creature comforts while traveling under the ocean. But I'm not the only one exploring these multiple processes going on at the same time. There is some promising research coming out of the University of Adelaide, Australia, focusing on producing hydrogen directly from seawater without all the extra steps and engine hybridization. You see, way down under, scientists have developed a system that can produce green hydrogen directly from seawater without the need for any pretreatment processes like desalination. The team behind the development, which involves the introduction of a Lewis acid layer on a transition metal oxide catalyst, say the method shows high potential for commercial application. Now, when you think about it, over 97% of the water on Earth's surface is saline water in the oceans. 2% is stored as freshwater in ice caps, glaciers, and snow-capped mountain ranges, and just 1% is available for our daily water supply needs. As you know, saline water can be made into potable water through a process called desalination, a technique that some areas around the world rely on heavily to produce fresh water for human consumption and for domestic and industrial use. But desalination is an energy-demanding process, and worse still, it is often powered by energy sources which are unsustainable. And as I've mentioned already, splitting water into its constituent parts is also well understood. The process, known as electrolysis, uses a direct current between two electrodes immersed in an electrolyte to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen is formed at the cathode, or negative electrode, and oxygen at the positive electrode, or anode. Now, because a mix of gases can, explode, most electrolyzers separate the anode and cathode with a thick, porous plastic sheet, and metal catalysts such as nickel and iron are used to speed up reactions. Putting both of these processes together, namely desalinating seawater and then splitting it to create hydrogen, has been long hailed as one of the best solutions to provide clean and affordable fuel for energy that in turn could power everything from a city's electricity to making steel, producing fertilizer, or even as fuel for airplanes. The list of potential uses is a long one. And of course, that includes submarines. However, there is another reason why we're not already using hydrogen fuel to fly all over the world. And this reason is in addition to those laws of thermodynamics we already discussed. The other reason is that salt water and other impurities corrode electrodes, shortening their life. As those components are typically made of rare metals such as platinum, it just costs too much to keep replacing them. Chloride ions in seawater are also a problem, and chlorine electrooxidation reactions compete with oxygen evolution reactions on the anode during electrolysis. This reaction results in the release of toxic and corrosive chlorine species such as hypochlorite. Hypochlorite is relatively unstable, and it can release toxic chlorine gas when mixed with ammonia or acid, and it can also eat away at stainless steel. Now, to get around this, the seawater could be desalinated and purified before processing it. But, this isn't always financially viable either. Another option is to coat the electrodes with polyanions to suppress corrosion, but this too can be costly. But it's definitely a better way to go, as I'll get to in a moment. And while they continue to work on things in Australia, I will continue to develop and optimize the hybrid approach. But like I just said, even for me, the corrosion is an issue. But what definitely helped me is that I had a large amount of polyanions donated to me for helping out the owner of an electronics factory in Taiwan after an unusual infestation of tarantulas, which was even more unusual since tarantulas are not native to Taiwan at all and are only brought in as pets. It turned out the largest tarantula farm nearby went out of business, and they didn't bother to relocate any of the spiders. But the real issue was that the Taiwan electronics factory was making electronic light-up bananas for some reason, and that was both luring and confusing all of the escaped and abandoned tarantulas. Now, it's an unusual fact that tarantulas like bananas, but not necessarily to eat. They like to hide in the bunches or get moisture from them. But to be honest, it wouldn't surprise me if there were a few tarantulas that just liked bananas. Anyway, after I explained this to the owner of the electronics factory, they then switched to light up pomegranates, and I spearheaded an effort to also relocate all of the displaced tarantulas and find them homes with other pet owners, which was just as challenging as you may think it was. Anyway, when the dust settled, the factory owner was quite grateful and gave me my choice of coating or component, and I chose the polyanions, and they have come in more than handy and have made my engine even more cost-effective. Anyway, speaking of the engine, it took a couple more hours, but I jumped in and helped Frank and his team install the wet system and helped with the other upgrades. I'm not afraid to roll up my sleeves and get my hands dirty, as you know. Soon the propulsion system upgrades were in place, the galley and game room upgrades were completed, including an upgrade to my auto-leveling gimbal platform system so I could play pool, and I also upgraded all the reading lights, which I thought was important. Frank was working on a few more safety tests, and I did a walkthrough inspection on my own. Everything was going smoothly, and I would be launching the submarine into the Pacific Ocean soon to confront Professor P. It was almost time, and I was ready. I had to be prepared for whatever awaited me, and I hoped I had an umbrella for every occasion. I was bringing my custom unbreakable umbrellas 1 through 6, and I was fairly certain they would be enough. But you never know until you get there. I was thinking a bit on how different it would be to go it alone on this one. Sure, I've been on solo adventures many times, like when I searched for the legendary Soul Glacier in the Tongass National Forest up in Alaska. And I've brought full crews with me, like on the Recovery when we searched for Captain Kidd's lost treasure, and found it, to going to Mars with a full crew in my spaceship, the Journeyman. But this time would be different. I was going it alone, but with purpose and conviction. I had to confront Professor P, defeat him, and then get information where to find my lost mentor, Professor Sampson. It would be a multi-part journey, and that's if things went according to plan, which they seldom do. I have a whole adventure in an alternative cheeseless universe that can attest to that. Speaking of which, I wondered how Chad was doing, as he had elected to stay. Everyone finds their place, I suppose. I continued my walk through submarine inspection, and everything looked like it was in tip-top shape. Frank had offered to accompany me on this journey, but I declined. It would have been helpful to have a diver and a mechanic with me, for sure, but as I've said before, this was something I had to do alone. I was prepared. Plus, no offense to Frank, but I find his pet cricket Barney to be a little noisy and disruptive on long journeys, and I was looking forward to the peace and quiet. I was ready, and now it was time to depart. Frank and I completed all the safety tests and inspections, and then we exited the top hatch. Frank and his crew then hoisted the O2 up and out of dry dock and into the awaiting Pacific Ocean. I watched as the submarine slowly raised and lowered and then settled into the water. It was as if the submarine was once again happy to be home in its own element. I certainly understand how that feels. I was soon to be off again to unknown high adventure. I got an excited feeling in my stomach, and even though I would be facing unknown dangers, I couldn't help but be excited. I had already packed my things while in dry dock, so there was nothing left to do now but shove off. Frank shook my hand and smiled, and I thanked him again for all of his hard work. All systems were go. I once again opened the hatch and descended the ladder into the O2. The bright interior submarine lights greeted me, and I took a deep breath and prepared to launch out to sea. It was too shallow, obviously, by the dock, to dive right away, so I would be cruising slowly away from the coast until I hit deeper water. I started the hybrid O2 engine and the newly installed wet system from the Getty, and I was soon underway. The gentle hum of the engines relaxed me as I slowly charted a course and traveled out to sea. And I will tell you all about my sea voyage next time. But first, I want to talk to you about something. Now, I've always stressed the importance of knowing your limitations and that it's always okay to ask for help when you need it. I mean, I say that, but if I'm being honest, it's a lesson that doesn't always sink in with me and one I often have to relearn. I often like to do things myself, and it's difficult for me to ask for favors or for help sometimes. But it's something I'm working on, and the truth is, it's a necessary component to being successful and happy. No one gets there alone. However, there are certain things that you absolutely must do alone in order to grow and get stronger. I'm talking about personal challenges, battling a nemesis, and calling insurance companies. They are all difficult, but they are all one-person operations. Certain challenges are meant to be difficult, so you can come out stronger on the other side. So, know when to ask for help, and know when not to. Some things you'll need to get through on your own. No one can grow for you, and while you may not need help, remember that you'll always have people cheering you on. Godspeed, adventurers.
The Quiet Journeys of Professor Atwood was created, written, and performed by Chris Mancini and produced by White Cat Entertainment. It is a work of fiction. Maybe. Music and sound design by Ron Tansky at rontanskymusic.com. For more info and merchandise, including t-shirts, mugs, and blankets, go to whitecatentertainment.com.